Hey everyone, Mr. Wineland here with the last section of Chapter 9 as we're going into Wilson's New Freedom. Now, Wilson is elected President of the United States in the um, election in 1912, and he's already getting started. And within his inauguration day of March 3rd of 1913, which is crazy because inaugurations now happen in January, but these things. Some of these inaugurations were happening all the way back into March. But anyway, 5,000 women suffrage actually marched that day. One of them was Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, which we're going to talk a little bit later. Were members of the National American Women's Suffrage Association in 1916. And we see by the time Wilson began his campaign, the second term in 1916, the NAWSA's president Carrie Chapman Catt saw victory on the horizon, and Catt would ultimately lead an emergency suffrage convention in September 1916, inviting President Wilson, who had cautiously supported it, but within the 4 years, the passage of the suffrage amendment would happen for the progressive movement. And, Wilson, he was one who supported progressive ideas. He was one like Roosevelt who wanted to see change. Excuse me. Who wanted to see change in the federal government, but he believed in tacking large concentration of power in the freedom of the to give greater freedom to average citizens. Um, However, we're going to learn that his prejudices in the South are going to hold him back with African Americans. We see Wilson is the son, grandson, nephew of a Presbyterian ministers, had a very strict uprising, but very successful, would make his way into politics, first as a lawyer and a history professor, then later president of Princeton University, which is answer number 18. Ultimately, would make his way into politics as governor of New Jersey. As governor of New Jersey, he supported progressive legislative programs such as direct primary worker compensation, regulation of public utilities, railroads. He moved pretty quickly into the presidency, only serving 2 years as a governor. Wilson moved to enact his program, the New Freedom, which planned his attack on what he called the triple wall privilege, the trusts, tariffs, and high finance. So those are things he was going to attack. Answer number 20 is right there, monopolies. But during Wilson's administration, Congress was able to quickly enact on the antitrust measures with the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914, helped stop companies from buying stock to form monopolies. If the company violated the law, its officers could be prosecuted. The Clayton Act also specified that labor unions and farm organizations not only had the right to exist, but also would no longer be subject to antitrust law. So it allowed unions to be formed and have their voices heard, allowed them to strike, gave them a lot more rights. And the second major antitrust measure was the Federal Trade Commission Act of 1914, which set up the Federal Trade Commission, allowing them to be the new watchdog agency to investigate, regulate violations of unfair business practices. And under Wilson, we see that the administration sent out 400 cease and desist orders for companies engaged in illegal activity. So there you go. Long definition. If you need to pause, feel free to do so. Wilson worked to lower tariff rates, knowing that supporters of big business hadn't allowed such a reduction under Taft, and so we see that he gets in there and he lowers them much lower. And Wilson lobbied hard in 1913 for the Underwood Act, which would substantially reduce tariff rates for the first time since Civil War, so low to the extent of the Civil War. We then see he went to support this bill, because again, it had not been passed yet. To support this bill, he would make a plea to Congress. He called them to let him know of his support of this bill. This would ultimately set precedents, what is known as the State of the Union address, where the State of the Union would be a way for the president from Wilson on to basically state out their case and let Congress know, hey, this is what I want to accomplish this year. To be fair, Wilson loved to hear himself talk, so there's a big reason why this was successful. But anyway, businesses lobbied too to try and reduce this or not, hit this down, but or to get rid of this. But because the new president's bully pulpit using the State of the Union, it inspired the Senate, and they were able to cut tariffs, and as well as the House had done. So it was ratified in 1913. Ratified in 1913, the 16th Amendment legalized a federal income tax. This was put in place because when lowering tariffs, that lowered the revenue for government to give them any sort of income or money, excuse me, to carry out certain bills. The income tax provided a tax to the individual's earnings and corporate profits, helped bring revenue and after tariffs were lowered. Under this graduated tax, large incomes were taxed at higher rates than smaller incomes. We see that the tax began with a modest tax on family incomes over 4,000 and ranged from 1% to a maximum 6% on incomes over 5,000. So it was fair. The lower the less money you made, the lower rate you had to pay. The more money you had to pay, the more you had to pay. So um, in 1917, the government was receiving more money from the income tax than it had ever gained from tariffs, and we see that income taxes on corporation individuals today represent the federal government's main source of revenue. So Wilson turned his attention to financial reform, trying to strengthen banks and giving them the ability to have a little bit more circulation of money, also a little bit more credit into the system, just kind of make things more stable to have any sort of financial assistance that could help. Wilson's solution was the Federal Reserve Act, private banking system under federal control, divided the nation into 12 districts and established a regional central bank in each district. Excuse me. The idea was the Federal Reserve banks could actually help issue more currency in emergency situations, provide the credit quickly to these banks to give them the support they need. The Federal Reserve banks could transfer funds to member banks in trouble, saving banks from closing and protecting customer savings. By 1923, you see roughly 70% of the nation's banking resources were put under the FRS. The Federal Reserve is what they call it now. One of the Wilson's most enduring achievements is this system still serves as our part of our banking system today. That's a big part of what happened with coronavirus. It provided a lot more income, circulation of credit and funds into our banking system. The educated native-born middle class. Excuse me. Woo. The educated native-born middle-class women had been active in the progressive movement as well, grown increasingly impatient. Um, is for their right to vote. Even though Wilson was successful in other aspects of the progressive movement, he was not dealing with women's right to vote. By 1910, women had federal voting rights in Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, Washington, and now Idaho. Determined for the suffrage movement, they finally saw success come within reach as a result of three developments. We see local groups, the use of bold new strategies build enthusiasm for movements, and then the rebirth of national movement under Carrie Chapman Catt. And Carrie Chapman Catt was one who wanted to have success. She wasn't the only one, to be fair. Suffrage movement was given new strength, growing numbers of college-educated women like the Boston Equal Suffrage Association for Good Government and College Equal Suffrage League used door-to-door campaigns to reach supporters. Founded by Maud Wood Park, the Boston group would spread the message, reaching out to working-class women, going everywhere they could, taking the trolley, making stops and making speeches in public. Um, Emmeline Pankhurst, the British suffrage, used increasingly bold tactics such as heckling government officials to advance their cause. A lot of women died because of the police beat a lot of those women and attacked women. But one interesting thing about the women in Britain during their suffrage movement is they learned what is it? They learned martial arts, and which allowed them to defend themselves and protect them in certain situations. Inspired by their activism, American women returned to the United States armed with similar approaches, not quite with violence, but at least not not backing down from intimidation. So Susan B. Anthony had passed away, or was getting old, and she was about to pass away, and so she obviously named her successor for president of the NAWSA, which was Carrie Chapman Catt, who served from 1900 to 1904, and then resumed the presidency in 1915. Catt concentrated on five tactics: painstaking organizing, close ties between local and state and national workers. They knew that even if an amendment does get passed nationally, you're going to need the state support. So getting the local leaders involved helped establishing a wide base of support for cautious lobbying and then gracious ladylike behavior, showing that we're still ladies and we still need to show them we're not trying to be threatening, but we definitely want this. So like I said, we talked about earlier, Burns and Paul formed a little bit more radical organization, the Congressional Union, and its successor, the National Women's Party. In 1970, Paul had organized her followers to mount a round-the-clock picket line around the White House to pass the amendment. Some picketers were arrested, jailed, even force-fed in their attempted to hunger strike. But these efforts and the Americans' involvement in World War I really helped the suffrage movement. We see that patriotic women, American women, were heading committees, knitting socks for soldiers, and sold Liberty bonds, which helped show their support for the war. And then eventually that kind of grew more attention to the amendment. And then eventually by 1919, Congress passed the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote. The amendment won final ratification in August 1920, 72 years after women had first convened and demanded the vote in Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. Even though Wilson was successful for some parts of the progressive movement, he's still disappointed the social reform aspect. In particular, on racial matters, Wilson appeased to um, conservative Southern Democratic voters, but disappointed his Northern white black supporters. And he placed segregationists in charge of federal agencies, who expanded racial segregation in the federal government as well as military in Washington, D.C. This really grew a lot of frustration. I mean, Wilson was supposed to be different from Taft and Roosevelt, but like them, he really ignored civil rights in office. And look, part of it was the timing. There wasn't really a lot of support within Congress as well as certain parts around the country. And also, too, the women's suffrage movement was gaining a little bit more attention than that of the NAACP's ability to try and ask for more civil rights. We see that there was a lot of disappointment with Wilson. They wanted him to speak out against lynching during the presidential campaign. However, Wilson opposed federal anti-lynching legislation, arguing that the crimes fell under state jurisdiction. Whether or not he truly believed that, maybe it was a sign of weakness that he just was not strong enough to address this issue. He just did not want to do it. And Wilson would ultimately further frustrate a lot of these progressives by appointing white Southerners who extended segregation. For example, Secretary of Navy Joseph Daniels proposed at a cabinet meeting to do away with common drinking fountains and towels in his department. And African Americans and their liberal white supporters felt betrayed by Wilson. We see by November 12th, 1914, the president's reception of African American delegation brought the confrontation to a bitter climax. We see William Monroe Trotter, editor-in-chief of The Guardian and an African American Boston newspaper, led the delegation, complaining that African Americans from 38 states had asked the president to reverse the segregation of the government employees, but the segregation had since increased. They had gotten into several arguments back and forth with Trotter, waving his finger at Wilson, frustrated with him, and even Wilson responding back really snippy. And all it did was hurt not only Wilson's reputation, but the ability for the progressive movement to move forward. So Wilson's refusal to extend civil rights to African Americans pointed to his limits of the progressivism under his administration. But ultimately, this would be a moot point because a lot of this stuff would be put on hold because of what would come up in Europe, and that was World War I would occur. And so we see the outbreak of World War I distracts Americans from certain other reforms. We see reform efforts stall after taking office in 1913. Wilson had said that there's no chance of progress and reform in an administration in which war plays the principal part. And that was a big part. The war really did halt efforts for any sort of other movement when it came to progressivism, because the focus was no longer about just us. You now had imperialism really had been playing a factor in World War One, and it's carrying over in Europe, and that brought a lot of attention to our country. So the international conflict. And during the early years of his administration, Wilson had dealt with issues of imperialism and had roots in the late 19th century. However, World War One would dominate most of the second term as president and the progressive era, and had to come to an end. And we're going to talk more about that as we move forward along. But that's going to do it for chapter 9.